The 17th of July, 1944. 8 Soviet fighters climbed from their airfield in Belarus. What followed would trigger an unprecedented order from the Luftwaffe command, and then history forgot about it entirely. The Yakovlev Yak-3 was so small, so light, that German pilots initially dismissed it. It weighed less than 5,900 pounds, fully loaded. The wingspan stretched just over 30 feet. To men who had spent years flying against heavy, lumbering Soviet aircraft, the tiny Soviet interceptor looked almost toy-like. But within weeks of entering service in 1944, the Yak-3 became something the Luftwaffe could not ignore. Something so lethal at low altitude that Berlin issued a direct order: avoid engaging it below 5,000 meters. And not just avoid it. Avoid combat with any Yak fighter, unless you had a numerical advantage or the altitude advantage. This was the first time the Luftwaffe had issued such an order about a Soviet aircraft. It would be the only time. To understand how a Soviet fighter could force the mighty Luftwaffe into retreat, you have to understand the crisis that created it. By 1944, the Soviet Union had been bleeding for 3 years. Operation Barbarossa had shattered the Red Army Air Force in 1941, destroying thousands of aircraft and killing tens of thousands of pilots. Survivors learned brutal lessons about fighting the Germans, lessons written in the wreckage of inadequate fighters like the I-16 and early Yak-1s. By 1943, Soviet aircraft like the Luftwaffe and Yak-9 had finally begun to contest the Luftwaffe's air superiority. But there was still a gap that got smaller, but was still there. Alexander Sergeyevich Yakovlev, the designer who had already given the Red Army the Yak-1 and Yak-9, had a radical idea. What if he stripped a fighter down to nothing, removed every unnecessary pound, removed everything that wasn't critical to survival? The Yakovlev Design Bureau started with the airframe of the Yak-1, the grandfather of the line. Then they removed it piece by piece. They cut away wood from the fuselage. They shortened the fuselage. They reduced the wing area. The vertical stabilizer got smaller. The horizontal stabilizer got smaller. The landing gear became even more basic. Every modification served one goal: make the lightest, most agile dogfighter that could be built. The engine choice was crucial. They installed the Klimov VK-105 PEV, the same engine that powered the Yak-9. But Yakovlev's team extracted every possible horsepower, fuel injection, improved supercharger tuning. The engine produced 1,700 horsepower, not much by German standards, but an airframe that weighed barely 5,500 pounds empty. The power-to-weight ratio was extraordinary, better than the Bf-109 G, better than the FW-190 in specific performance domains. The armament was simple: one 20mm cannon firing through the prop shaft and two 12.7mm machine guns, less than some German fighters carried. But Yakovlev's philosophy was that in a turning fight below 5,000 meters, firepower mattered less than the ability to bring guns to bear. And with the Yak-3's agility, you could bring those guns to bear from angles no German fighter could match. The Yak-3 first flew in 1943. By July of 1944, it had entered frontline service with the Soviet Air Force. The timing was perfect. Operation Bagration, the massive Soviet summer offensive aimed at recapturing Belarus, was underway. The Luftwaffe had committed its best units to defend the sector guards. Regiments, veteran pilots, with hundreds of kills between them. What happened over the next 2 weeks became legendary in Soviet aviation and almost completely unknown in the West. On the 16th of June, 1944, 18 Yak-3s encountered 20 4 German aircraft, a mix of Bf-109s and Fw-190s, escorting bombers. The Soviet pilots, flying a new aircraft they were still learning to handle, executed a textbook bounce. They dove out of the sun, struck hard, and stayed aggressive. The result was catastrophic for the Luftwaffe. 15 German aircraft shot down. 1 Yak-3 destroyed, 1 damaged, 15-1 in a single engagement. The Luftwaffe. Pilots who survived filed reports that were read all the way up to command headquarters in Berlin. Then, on the 17th of July, the same week, something even more spectacular happened. 8 Yak-3 fighters were on patrol over Belarus. 8. They weren't looking for trouble. Their commander was receiving constant radio updates from ground-controlled interception Soviet radar operators guiding them toward threats, and then the controller's voice crackled in their headsets. A formation of German aircraft, 60 strong, was approaching from the north. Bombers escorted by fighters. The 8 Soviet pilots vectored toward them. What the Germans didn't know was that they were about to encounter a fighter unlike anything they'd faced before. The 8 Yak-3s climbed into the sun. They got above the German formation. Then they attacked. The combat that followed was short, brutal, and one-sided. The German escorts were caught off guard. The Soviet pilots, in their tiny, nimble fighters, dove, slashed through the formation, climbed away, dove again. The Germans tried to turn with them. Mistake. The Yak-3's turning radius was too tight. Men who had trained their entire careers to dominate in the vertical and horizontal planes found themselves outmaneuvered in both. When the engagement broke off, 7 German aircraft were destroyed. 3 were heavily damaged, and every single Yak-3, all 8 of them, returned to base without a scratch. Not one pilot injured. Not one aircraft with combat damage. 1. The reports that came back to the Luftwaffe command described something that shouldn't have been possible. 8 fighters against 60. Defeat for the Germans. The Soviet aircraft were described as incredibly agile, impossible to outturn, and devastating. In a vertical fightif, you let them get above you. But the most important detail, the detail that changed everything, was the low-altitude performance. Below 5,000 meters, the Yak-3 was untouchable. The Luftwaffe issued its order 3 days later. All fighter squadrons on the Eastern Front received a directive from High Command. The language was stark and direct. Avoid combat below 5,000 meters with Yakovlev. Fighters lacking an oil cooler intake beneath the nose. This was the Yak-3 they were, describing the original production model, unless numerically superior or at a height advantage. This wasn't a suggestion. This wasn't a tactical guideline. This was a direct order from the command structure. The Luftwaffe, masters of the skies since 1939, had conceded defeat in one domain to a Soviet aircraft. And not just any domain. The domain where most air combat actually happened, where the fighting took place above the front, 2 lines, where the war was actually won and lost. Why was the Yak-3 so devastating at low altitude? The answer lies in aircraft design philosophy. A fighter optimized for high altitude needs a program, powerful supercharger, to maintain performance as the air grows thin. A high-altitude fighter is heavy, complex, built to withstand the stresses of rapid compression and decompression. The Bf-109 was built that way. The Fw-190 was built that way. The Yak-3 rejected that approach. Yakovlev built for the Eastern Front. And on the Eastern Front, air combat happened low. The front lines were close. Pilots didn't have time to climb to 30,000 feet and circle for advantage. They had to fight where the rubble. Ground war was raging, and at 2,000 meters, 3,000 meters, 4, raging, 4,000 meters. At those altitudes, where the air is thick and responsive, the Yak-3's lightweight and powerful engine became almost magical. The Bf-109G was actually a good dogfighter, but it was 5 tons. The Yak-3 was less than 3 tons empty. In a turning fight, that ratio was everything. The Yak-3 could turn inside the German fighter, could outclimb it, could out-accelerate Iten-level flight. And once a German pilot realized he was in a turning fight with a Yak-3, he had already lost. The German response was tactically sound. They ordered their pilots to never get drawn into a turning contest with the Yak-3 below 5,000 meters. Instead, they should use the German fighter's strengths, speed in a dive, power in a climb at altitude, the ability to outzoom and reposition. But that order also meant something else. It meant accepting that below 5,000 meters over the Soviet Union, the Luftwaffe could not guarantee air superiority. On the Eastern Front in 1944, that was a revolutionary admission. Marcel Albert, the top-scoring French ace, flew the Yak-3 with the Normandy Niemen Regiment, a French unit flying alongside the Soviet Air Force. After the war, Albert made a statement that would have been unthinkable in 1940. He said the Yak-3 was superior to the P-51 Mustang and superior to the Supermarine Spitfire. Not by a lot, but superior. He knew both aircraft intimately. He'd flown them all. And his judgment was that the Yak-3, in the hands of a competent pilot at altitudes where it was designed to fight, was the finest dogfighter of the Second World War. By the end of 1944, the Yak-3 had equipped multiple Soviet air regiments. Production eventually reached 4,848 aircraft, nearly 5,000 fighters optimized for one specific job: defending Soviet territory from below, contesting the Luftwaffe in the domain where the Luftwaffe had once dominated. The aircraft saw combat through the end of the war. Soviet and German pilots would encounter it until May 1945, and throughout that time, the Luftwaffe never revoked its order: avoid below 5,000 meters. It became institutionalized. In Luftwaffe tactics, German pilots learned it first day of training. Get above the Yak-3. Get above 5,000 meters. Down there, you can't win. After the war, the Yak-3 served in the Yugoslav and Polish air forces. A handful flew briefly with other Soviet allies. But the jet age came quickly, and the Yak-3 retired. Today, very few survive. Most were scrapped or destroyed, but a couple examples remain. In Russian museums, reminders of a moment when the Soviet Union not only challenged German air superiority, but defeated it at least in the spaces where the war was actually fought. The Yak-3 has been largely forgotten in the West. The Spitfire, the Mustang, the Bf-109, these became legends. The Yak-3, one of the finest dogfighters ever built, disappeared into obscurity. Butif, you'd been a German pilot in 1944, patrolling over Belarus at 3,000 meters. You would have understood exactly why the order existed. You would have known the Yak-3's reputation. You would have respected it, because that tiny, Soviet fighter had forced the Luftwaffe to retreat from the skies where the war was actually being won. And that's something the history books nearly forgot. Next time, we're exploring the aircraft that could have changed everything for Germany if it had arrived sooner. The jet that was designed to outrun anything in the sky. Subscribe so you don't miss it. Thanks for watching.